November 12, 1968. Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Mike Reeves lay absolutely motionless in the undergrowth, barely breathing. 6 inches from his face, a North Vietnamese soldier's boot crunched through dead leaves. Then another, then another. The entire NVA company, maybe 120 men, was passing within arm's reach of his 5-man LRRP team. Reeves didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even swallow. 3 months ago, he would have been dead. 3 months ago, his team would have been compromised the moment they inserted, their movement through the jungle announcing their presence like a marching band. They would have used hand signals the enemy could see, set up in positions the enemy could predict, moved in patterns the enemy had learned to track. But 3 months ago, Reeves had spent 2 weeks with an Australian SAS patrol, men who'd learned their craft in the Malayan emergency and perfected it in Borneo. Men who moved through jungle like ghosts, who could sit 3 feet from an enemy trail for days without detection, who seemed to simply vanish when danger approached. The Aussies had taught him something that seemed impossible: how to become invisible. The last NVA soldier passed. Reeves counted to 300, another Australian trick, before keying his radio just once. No words, just a click. His team lay in position another hour before the exfiltration helicopter came for them, its crew never knowing they'd extracted a team that had just let an entire enemy company walk past them untouched. Back at base, Reeves would report the enemy location, strength, and direction. Artillery would do the rest. But the magic, the real magic, was that the NVA never knew the Americans had been there at all. It was the Australian way, and it was changing everything about how America fought in the jungle. When the first American Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol teams deployed to Vietnam in 1965, they brought with them the confidence of a superpower and the tactics of Fort Benning. They wore standard jungle fatigues, carried standard loads, and moved with standard American efficiency. They also died with alarming regularity. "We thought we were the best trained soldiers in the world," recalled Captain James Quinn, who commanded an early LRRP platoon in 1966. "We had Ranger tabs, airborne wings, the best equipment money could buy. Then we went into the jungle and realized we were basically announcing our presence to every VC within a mile." The American approach to reconnaissance in 1965 to 66 reflected conventional military thinking. Teams of 6 to 8 men would patrol through designated areas, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and calling in artillery or airstrikes. They carried M16s, grenades, radios, and enough ammunition to fight their way out of trouble. Their uniforms were fresh from supply, their equipment was top of the line, and the enemy could hear them coming from 100 yards away. "The VC called us the walking metal men," said Sergeant First Class Donald Hayes. "Our gear clinked and rattled, our boots squeaked. We smelled like American soap and insect repellent. We might as well have been carrying signs." The statistics were brutal. In the first 18 months of LRRP operations, contact rates, the percentage of patrols that encountered the enemy, ran above 40%. For teams whose entire mission was to remain undetected while gathering intelligence, this was catastrophic. Worse, casualties were mounting. Teams that were supposed to observe and report were instead fighting for their lives, often requiring emergency extraction under fire. Major General William Dupuy, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, recognized the problem. "We're sending Ranger-qualified soldiers on reconnaissance missions," he noted in a 1966 after-action review. "But we're training them to fight like infantry. We need them to think like intelligence gatherers first, fighters last." The answer, it turned out, was already in country. They wore slouch hats, spoke with Australian accents, and moved through the Vietnamese jungle like they'd been born there. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AATTV, arrived in 1962. But it was the deployment of the Australian Special Air Service Squadron in 1966 that would revolutionize American reconnaissance operations. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The Australian SAS had cut their teeth in the Malayan Emergency, 1948-1960, where they'd perfected the art of deep jungle penetration against communist insurgents. In Malaya, the Australians had learned lessons written in blood. Conventional tactics failed in the jungle. Noise discipline meant the difference between life and death. The enemy owned the terrain, so you had to become part of it. Speed and firepower mattered less than silence and patience. Captain Ken Gillespie, commanding the 1st Australian SAS Patrol in Vietnam, brought 12 years of jungle warfare experience. "We weren't there to teach the Americans how to fight," he said. "We were there to show them how to disappear." The Australian approach was radically different from American doctrine. Where American teams carried 60 to 80 pounds of gear, Australians went light, 40 pounds maximum. Where Americans wore standard-issue uniforms, Australians modified everything, removing metal buttons, adding extra pockets in specific places, even altering the cut of their fatigues to reduce snagging on vegetation. Most revolutionary was their movement philosophy. American teams, trained in the Ranger tradition, moved with purpose and speed. Australians moved like sloths, slowly, deliberately, stopping constantly to listen and observe. "We might take 2 hours to move 500 meters, recalled Warrant Officer Bob Milligan. "The Americans thought we were crazy, but we didn't get ambushed." The first formal contact between Australian SAS and American LRRP teams came in June 1966 at Nui Dat. Major George Mackay, commanding the LRRP element of the 1st Infantry Division, had heard rumors about the Australians' almost supernatural ability to operate undetected. He requested a training exchange. What happened next would change American special operations forever. June 18-29, 1960s, Nui Dat, Phuoc Tue Province. Sergeant Larry Chambers' first patrol with the Australians began with an insult. "You sound like a bloody tank platoon," said Corporal Barry Johnston, examining Chambers' gear. "Strip it down. Half that kit stays here." Johnston removed Chambers' metal canteen cups. "Use the canteen itself. Cups clank." He taped down every metal surface. He replaced the standard-issue rucksack with a locally modified version. He even removed the metal eyelets from Chambers' boots, replacing them with paracord. "But what if we need to fight our way out?" Chambers asked. Johnston smiled. "If we need to fight our way out, mate, we've already fucked up." The patrol inserted at dusk, another Australian innovation. American teams typically inserted at first light, giving themselves maximum daylight. The Australians inserted late in the day, used the remaining hours to move a short distance from the LZ, then went completely static. "Let the jungle settle around you," Johnston explained. "Let it accept you're part of it." What happened over the next 5 days shattered every assumption Chambers had about reconnaissance. The Australian team moved maybe 200 meters on day 1. They found a position overlooking a trail junction and simply stopped. For 3 days, they barely moved 50 meters, observing enemy traffic, documenting patterns, taking notes. When NVA soldiers passed within 10 feet, the Australians didn't flinch. They breathed slowly, moved only their eyes, became part of the vegetation. On day 4, an NVA patrol stopped to rest 15 feet from their position. Chambers could see the sweat on the enemy soldiers' faces. One NVA trooper sat down, his back against a tree, and pulled out rice to eat. Chambers' finger was on his M16 safety selector, ready to flip it to full auto. Johnston's hand touched his shoulder. Just pressure. No movement. The gesture was clear. Don't even think about it. The NVA soldier finished his rice, stood up, and walked away. The enemy patrol continued down the trail. The Australian team remained frozen for another hour before Johnston finally nodded. When they exfiltrated on day 6, Chambers was a convert. His team had been undetected for 5 days, observing an estimated 400 enemy troops, documenting 3 supply caches, and calling in coordinates for later airstrikes. 0 shots fired, 0 casualties, 0 compromise. It was like hunting, Chambers said later, but we were hunting ghosts. We became the thing that wasn't there. Operation Crimp, January 1967. The validation came in Operation Crimp, the massive search and destroy operation targeting the Hobo Woods. American LRRP teams, newly trained by Australian advisors, were inserted to provide early warning and target intelligence. Sergeant Mike Reeves' team, the same team from our opening, was among them. Using Australian techniques, they established a hide site overlooking a known infiltration route. For 4 days, they remained completely undetected, while hundreds of enemy troops moved past them. The VC had sentries out, Reeves recalled, professional troops who knew what to look for. But they walked right past us. One guy literally stepped over my leg and never noticed. That's when I knew this wasn't just good tactics. This was black magic. The intelligence they provided led to the most successful series of B-52 strikes of the operation, catching enemy forces in the open. The LRRP team's success rate, measured in undetected insertions and quality intelligence gathered, jumped from 60% to 94% in units that had trained with the Australians. The word spread through the American Special Operations community like wildfire. The Aussies knew something nobody else did. By late 1967, Australian SAS techniques had been formally integrated into American LRRP training. But it wasn't just about copying procedures. It was a fundamental shift in mindset. The cloverleaf technique. One of the most revolutionary Australian innovations was the cloverleaf insertion pattern. Instead of a single helicopter landing directly at the target area, teams used multiple false insertions. The helicopter would touch down briefly at 3 or 4 locations before the team actually disembarked at the 5th. The VC were smart, explained Captain Tom Kramer, LRRP team leader with the 101st Airborne. They watched helicopter insertions and converged on the LZ. The cloverleaf pattern meant they couldn't know where we actually went in. We'd watch them search the first 3 false insertions while we moved away from the 4th. Combined with immediate, rapid movement away from the actual LZ, followed by a long static period, teams could effectively vanish. The enemy would search for hours in the wrong area, while the LRRP team sat motionless a kilometer away. The stay-behind ambush. Another Australian innovation was the stay-behind ambush. Instead of moving through an area, teams would insert, move a short distance, and then remain completely static for days, observing a single trail or junction. When high-value targets appeared, officers, supply columns, communication parties, they'd call in artillery or airstrikes rather than engage directly. We became human sensors, said Staff Sergeant James Hunt. The Aussies taught us that our rifles were a last resort, not a primary weapon. Our real weapons were our eyes, our patience, and that radio. Equipment modifications. When American teams adopted wholesale the Australian approach to equipment, metal canteen cups disappeared. Dog tags were taped or worn inside boots. Ammunition was carried in cloth bandoliers rather than metal magazines that clinked together. Even M16s were modified. Forward assists taped, charging handles wrapped in cloth, anything that might reflect light or make noise eliminated. The Australians introduced the concept of personal camouflage discipline. Americans learned to apply camouflage cream in specific patterns, to move vegetation to create natural concealment rather than using manufactured items, to position themselves so their silhouette broke up against background foliage. The Aussies showed us that camouflage wasn't just face paint, recalled Sergeant Donald Hayes. It was position, shadow, stillness, and patience all combined. They could sit 10 feet from you in the jungle and you'd never see them. We learned to do the same. Communication discipline. Perhaps most crucial was radio discipline. Australian teams used minimal radio traffic, pre-arranged signals, clicks instead of words, coded brevity codes. American teams, accustomed to regular situation reports, learned that every transmission was a potential compromise. We went from calling in hourly sit-reps to using one-click signals, said Captain Quinn. The Aussies convinced us that the enemy was listening, triangulating, and converging. Less talking meant longer survival. Vietnamese counter-adaptations, the enemy noticed the change. NVA after-action reports from 1968 noted that American reconnaissance teams had become more difficult to detect and engage. VC trackers, who had previously been able to follow American teams relatively easily, found their quarry had learned to move without leaving sign. They learned the forest, one captured NVA officer reported. Before we could hear them, now they moved like we did. Slowly, carefully. The advantage we had was disappearing. By 1968-69, American LRRP teams trained in Australian techniques were achieving remarkable results. The 75th Infantry Regiment, Ranger, which consolidated LRRP units, reported contact rates dropping to 15 to 20%, while intelligence quality soared. Operation Dewey Canyon, January-March 1969. During this operation in the A Shau Valley, LRRP teams from the 9th Marines provided continuous intelligence on NVA movements. Using Australian stay-behind techniques, they remained undetected for weeks, calling in over 100 fire missions that killed an estimated 1 to 200 NVA troops. We had teams in position for 21 days straight, reported Major William Warren. The NVA never knew they were there. Every supply column, every troop movement, we owned the intelligence picture completely. Team Cherokee, led by Staff Sergeant Billy Walkabout, part Cherokee, hence the call sign, established a hide site overlooking Route 922, the primary NVA supply line. For 19 days, they counted trucks, documented cargo, and called in airstrikes. They were extracted without ever firing a shot. The Aussie way worked because it was patient, Walkabout said. We weren't there to kill 10 guys. We were there to find 1,000 guys so artillery could kill them. Big difference. Enemy perspective. The captured NVA intelligence report from late 1968 revealed the impact. American reconnaissance elements have adopted new tactics that make detection difficult. They no longer move carelessly through our areas. They employ techniques similar to our own scouts. Greater vigilance is required. This was perhaps the highest compliment, the enemy acknowledging that Americans had learned to fight on Vietnamese terms. Statistical impact between 1967 and 1970. LRRP teams trained in Australian techniques. Reduced casualties by 68%. Increased undetected insertion rates from 60% to 93%. Improved intelligence quality ratings from satisfactory to excellent. Called in fire missions that inflicted estimated 8.1 casualty ratios against enemy forces. The techniques didn't just save American lives. They made the reconnaissance mission devastatingly effective. Teams that survived longer gathered better intelligence. Intelligence that was gathered undetected was more accurate because the enemy didn't know they were being observed. The Australian SAS gift to American special operations extended far beyond Vietnam. When the 75th Ranger Regiment was reorganized, Australian techniques became doctrine. When Delta Force was formed in 1977, its selection and training incorporated lessons learned from the Aussies. When SEAL Team 6 was established, its rural reconnaissance training drew directly from the LRRP experience in Vietnam. What the Australians taught us, reflected General Wayne Downing, former commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, was that being invisible is more powerful than being heavily armed, that patience beats speed, that the best gunfight is the one you avoid by never being detected in the first place. The legacy lives in every special operations unit today. The quiet professionalism, the attention to the smallest detail, the understanding that reconnaissance is about intelligence rather than combat. All trace back to Australian SAS advisors patiently teaching eager but loud American soldiers how to move through the jungle like ghosts. Sergeant Mike Reeves, whose team let that NVA company walk past them in November 1968, retired from the Army in 1986. On his desk, he kept a photo of himself with Corporal Barry Johnston, the Australian who taught him the trade. "Barry taught me something I carried my whole career," Reeves said. "He said, 'Mate, the enemy can't kill what they can't find, so don't let them find you.' Simple as that. Changed everything." The Australian SAS only deployed 2 squadrons to Vietnam. Maybe 500 men total rotated through. But their impact on American special operations doctrine influenced hundreds of thousands of soldiers who came after, turning America's elite reconnaissance forces from aggressive raiders into patient, invisible observers who owned the jungle without firing a shot. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that remains hidden.